All right. Hey there. Good to see you. Welcome back to the channel. Today, I'd like to talk about a cool book that I read recently. It's called Syntax, A Cognitive Approach. It's by Ted Gibson, who you see here. So if you don't know Ted, Ted is one of the leading psycholinguists of our time. He's working at MIT. He has been collaborating with all sorts of people, including Dan Everett of Piraha fame. He is married to Ev Fedorenko, world-leading neurolinguist. He has been a colleague of Chomsky's, of course. And so he has very interesting views and ideas. And as soon as I saw this book coming out, I thought, hey, that might be worth talking about on this channel. So I've read it, and spoiler alert, I'm not disappointed. It's really cool. You need to check it out. It's open access, so you can download it from Ted's webpage. It's free, yeah. And so I just like to say a few things about it. Now, a book with this title comes across as like a general introduction to maybe one syntactic theory. That's not at all what this book is. It's more like a summary, a synthesis of all the stuff that Ted's been working on for the past years. And I mean, he does introduce a syntactic framework, dependency grammar, in that book, but that's not the main point. Yeah, the main point is the one that you see here. Yeah, so the book has a message, namely that utterances with long dependencies between words are hard to process. And this main point is unpacked in various ways in the different chapters. And so what you get is a very thorough exploration of the ideas surrounding this general point. And I can illustrate it just with a quick example. Here are two sentences. One of them sounds better than the other one. And if you want to, you can pause the video here and you can just see for yourself which of the two sentences you find more agreeable, easier to process. Let me just read them to you. The first is, I gave the key to a manager sitting at the hotel reception. And the second one is, I gave a manager sitting at the hotel reception the key. All right, I'm going to continue in 3, 2, 1. Here we go. So obviously the second one is a bit clumsy, yeah, so it doesn't roll off the tongue as nicely, it doesn't compute as easily as the first one, and the reason for that, Ted argues, is in the dependencies that we have in the sentence. So you recognize the verb give as a ditransitive verb. That means it calls for two objects, the key and the manager. And then the first variant of the two sentences, those dependencies are relatively short. But in the second one, we have to wait like the end of the sentence to get to the key. And that is, somewhat inconvenient and makes the sentence less easy to process. So that's the main message. Really, longer dependencies are harder to process. And harder to process, that's something that we can measure. So Ted advocates really for acceptability ratings in experimental settings, but there are also behavioral measures like longer reading times, more effort as shown in brain imaging, and so on and so forth. The key element being that you need to be able to measure it in some way in order to see how it works. Right. So I'll say more about this in just a second, but I also wanted to say that I really enjoyed the book because it features a bunch of hot takes, you might say. Yeah. So he says that LLMs, large language models, are the best current theory of human language. Now, we can all agree that LLMs produce fantastic results and are, a surprising technological achievement. Are they a scientific theory of language? Can all the linguists not working on LLMs go home now? I don't think they can, yeah, but go to the book, check out what he has to say. Another hot take that really rubbed me the wrong way was that language is domain specific. So if you know me and the channel, you know that I subscribe to a usage-based view, meaning that language is founded on domain general sociocognitive processes. And here Ted is very clear. He says, no, it's really language is language specific. There's a language circuit in the brain that handles language processing and nothing else. And so usage-based guys, you can stick it. Yeah. Well, okay. So he also says that's kind of a more specific variant of the previous hot take, that syntax is autonomous, which is like a classic generative mainstay argument that syntax is independent of meaning and it works on its own. Yeah. So combining words, that is a module that functions for itself without reference to other issues. Okay, he also says that thought and language are two different things. So going against Sapir-Whorf and going against the idea that language is primarily a vehicle for thought, which is like a famous Chomskyan talking point. I was going to mention this later, but so Ted appeared on the Lex Friedman podcast, and there the two of them were talking, and both of them actually don't have an inner monologue, which was freaking me out. Yeah, so in my head, I hear voices all the time. Most of the time, it's my own voice. I'm talking to myself. But Ted mentioned an example. So he said, well, apparently, when people get emails, they hear the voices of their colleagues that sent those emails. And I said, yes, of course. I hear those voices. Yeah. Anyway, Ted is different. Lex Friedman is different. What can you say? Another hot take that he came out with was that syntax in his model, so dependency grammar, does not need constituency, which I thought, wait a minute. I've been teaching syntactic constituency to generations of students. That I thought was among the ideas that form sort of the bedrock of, what linguists can agree on. Nope. It's no longer there. Okay. He also says things that I didn't know what to make of. So he says that dialects are mutually understandable varieties of the same language. Yeah, I mean, I live in Switzerland, and there are varieties of Swiss German that, I don't stand a chance. And vice versa, if I use my, Northern German vowels and vocabulary items on my Swiss German friends, they don't get much either. So, I don't know. I don't even know what that statement is doing in this book. It doesn't have any bearing on the general argument. But anyway, there it is. There are lots of points that I agree with in the book. So, first of all, the basic insight that, languages have syntax. Utterances are syntactically structured. Words are connected to one another. There are associations. There's hierarchies, etc., etc. Yeah, okay. The meaning of utterances depends on syntactic structure. So, yes, again, this is one of the basic ideas that my students are exposed to early on, and everyone else's students for that matter. Yeah, so flying planes can be dangerous, visiting relatives can be a nuisance. The different meanings depend on different syntactic parses. Then, Ted says that grammar is learnable from the input. In contradiction to generative linguistics from the very start. So yes, of course, I agree with that, and he has a story of his views on this. I also agree that language structure is designed for efficient communication. Yeah. So Ted says language is for communication; it's not for thinking, and I can agree with that. Yeah. The language structure shows you what people need to do, what people need to achieve regularly. I also agree that you need quantitative data to test linguistic theories, and I also agree that syntactic movement, he has an entire chapter on that, is not a useful theory of language structure. Well, that's just my theoretical upbringing. Other people will have different opinions on that, but for me, no empty elements, no movement in syntax. Other assumptions that he makes right at the get-go is that there are parts of speech, which are the basic building blocks of his syntactic theory. One assumption that he makes where I disagree is that he says grammar for him, that's syntax. It's just combining words. It's not related to meaning or anything. And yeah, so I find this is a more clinical, I want to say impoverished view of what grammar really is. If you come from like a grammaticalization background, you have a much richer idea of what grammar actually is. Yeah. Okay, so but for him, the goal of linguistics is to find a syntax that generates all grammatically acceptable sentences and only those sentences, so very much in the generative tradition. And since he's an empirical guy as well as a theoretical guy, he says, okay, how can we measure all of this? And he says that dependencies between words can be operationalized in terms of high mutual information. Again, co-occurrence frequencies, collocation, measures of association, mutual information. Yeah, I can go along with that. Right, let me give you an overview of the different chapters of the book. So everything starts with an introduction, obviously, on dependencies. Then he talks about the methods, so acceptability judgments in experimental contexts. He talks about dependency grammar in the third chapter, so that introduces kind of the grammatical framework. That's not something that he has done completely on his own. There are people like Dick Hudson, for example, who have been working on word grammar. There are other frameworks that are also working with dependencies. So in the book early on, he mentions, yeah, there's Tenière, there is Panini even. So this has a long tradition. It's not coming out of nowhere. But of course, the new stuff is where dependencies are related to processing and processing difficulties, and that happens in chapter 4. Yeah. All of that, he uses lots of English examples, a couple of other languages in between, but mostly English. But then in chapter 5, the perspective broadens a little bit, and he shows that grammars in general prefer short dependencies. Yeah, so if we compare the dependencies that we could see theoretically, yeah, if we take a theoretical baseline and we check what languages actually do, it turns out that grammars are designed in such a way that dependencies are kept short for the benefit of the speaker and for the benefit of the hearer. Okay, chapter 6 then goes on a tangent and talks about legal language and how in legal language there's lots of center embedding, which is like super costly in terms of dependencies. Yeah, interesting if you're into that sort of thing. Chapter 7 is about other theories of grammar. So he mentions, oh yeah, there's also construction grammar, there's also X-bar syntax. There's a bunch of different frameworks. Yeah, okay. I find that useful. I like it when people try to situate their approach in a wider landscape of theories, and that happens there. Chapter 8 is on syntactic movement and how, for him, it doesn't really work. Okay, I didn't need a lot of convincing there, you know, but, well, I like the way he engages with Chomskyan research and Chomskyan arguments. It's respectful, it is very knowledgeable, and it is critical in a good way. Yeah? So I wish more people would be doing it like that. Anyway, chapter 9 goes into the issue of language is not thought, and it's really about the neural circuitry that supports language. And then chapter 10 goes into the issue of efficiency, so that language structure can be seen to support efficient communication. And then chapter 11 is the conclusion that rounds things out. Okay, so I am just going to talk about chapters 3, 4, 5, and 9, yeah, because those, I think, constitute the core of the argument. And so let's dig right in and talk about dependency grammar, which is the formalism or the framework that he chooses for the book and for his general argument. And now, if you haven't been exposed to dependency grammar, you will have seen some kind of phrase structure grammar in your introduction to linguistics. If you haven't had any of this, don't worry, it's really not that difficult. Yeah? So the idea is that words are interdependent. So there are words from which other words depend. And here we have a simple example, a simple noun phrase, a Canadian hat. It's a noun and an adjective that modifies the noun. The noun is what is called the root, and then Canadian is a modifier that is a dependent of that root, and that is illustrated with this little arrow there. Yeah? And so in a phrase structure grammar, you would diagram this like this. You have an adjective and a noun, and then both of those form a noun phrase. And it's really the same idea. Yeah, it's just diagrammed, it's represented differently, but the idea is the same. So here are two diagrams of the same phrase parsed in different ways. So Canadian hat maker is ambiguous. Is it the hat that is Canadian, or is it the hat maker that is Canadian? The first graph that you see here, well, it's the hat that is modified by Canadian. And in the second one, it's the maker that is Canadian. Yeah? So again, you could use phrase structure tree diagrams to represent the same kind of idea. So it's really, if you've never seen this before, it takes 5 minutes to get used to, and then you can see what's going on. And in many ways, it's actually less clumsy, less cumbersome than trees when they get really, really long and tall. Of course, we can also diagram ambiguities like PP attachment. The spy saw the cop with the telescope. Is it the spy who has the telescope, or is it the cop who has the telescope? Yeah, so here in the first version, you see that the root, so the verb with sentences, it's always the verb, that's the root. It has two dependents. One is the cop, the object, and then saw also links up with the preposition with, which gives us the prepositional phrase with the telescope. Okay. Dependency grammar formalisms can do various things, including things that phrase structural grammars have to do with things like traces or movement or things like that. Yeah. So when we have, for example, a WH question where the WH word corresponds to an argument of a verb in a verb phrase, as in, what did Mary buy? Yeah, Mary bought something. Normally the something appears to the right hand side of the verb buy. Here we can capture that by just saying, all right, so buy has a dependency with the WH word. So that's actually super elegant if you think about it. Yeah, it shows us something useful, interesting, that would otherwise be difficult to represent in a tree-like structure. Okay, now on to the main point. Longer dependencies equal more difficult processing. I've already shown you an example earlier, yeah, but here we can actually see another example. Ted Gibson has lots of examples in the book. I had an example earlier with dative alternation. Here we have particle placement. So we have one sentence that is reasonably elegant. The first one, Mary threw away the important documents that you brought home yesterday. And then we have a second one that is more cumbersome. Mary threw the important documents that she brought home yesterday away. And you can immediately see in the way that this is documented that, okay, we have this long dependency between through and then the particle away. And that is what makes things slightly less convenient to process. There are lots of examples like this in the book. And each time you can see directly from the graph which example is actually more difficult to process. Yeah, that's kind of cool. So here we have another example of the dative alternation. So the one at the bottom of the slide, Alice gave the important documents that she brought home yesterday to Susan. Yeah, you recognize that as something that the speaker would probably try to avoid. Right. Here's another example. In English, quotations vary in interesting ways. So you can say things like, I agree, Jane said, and you can say, I agree, said Jane. And here the example at the bottom of the slide goes, I agree, Jane Smith, president of Smith, Brown & Jones, a consulting firm, said. Of course, no speaker in their right mind would do that when they have an alternative that's available. I agree, said Jane Smith. And you see that the dependencies are much more local. No, they're restricted to words that are just a few words away from each other. And that essentially is what makes the sentence easy to process. Okay, then this kind of reasoning also explains why center embedding is so fiendishly hard. Yeah? So here we have, let me read this to you. The boy who the dog, which the cat chased, bit, was upset. If this sounds like word soup to you, I don't blame you. Yeah, it's really, really difficult. But if you figure it out bit by bit, you can see that, all right, there was a boy who was upset. Yeah, it's the boy who the dog bit. Yeah, so the boy was bitten by the dog, and the dog is the dog which the cat chased. So we have three events basically: a cat chasing a dog, a boy being bitten by the dog, and then the boy being upset as a result. If you try and diagram this in the dependency style, you see that there are just connections going back and forth all over the place. And that means not only do you have to keep track of these long distances, you also have to keep multiple tabs open at the same time. And at some point, your language processor just conks out and says, look, I'm not doing this. This doesn't compute. Okay. And of course, you can do things much simpler and just say the cat chased the dog, which bit the boy, who was then upset. Now, so, sorry. Speakers try to do things that are simple for them and that are simple for the hearer. Right. I mentioned that there are two different types of costs. So the first cost Ted describes as integration costs. So longer dependencies are, as such, more costly. So whenever you see like a long arc here, that means that, all right, that's going to cost you a little bit of attention. You have to hold that thing in working memory until all of those other words are produced. And the second cost Ted calls storage costs, so dependencies that are open at the same time. They are costly, and that is just what happens with these center embedded constructions where you have to, I haven't actually counted them, yeah, but the boy who the dog, which the cat. Yeah, at this point there are like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, dependencies that you have to keep in mind, and your working memory. You remember magical number 7 plus or minus 2. For me, that magical number is definitely minus 2, if not minus 4. So I can I can think of 3 things and then the rest I forget. Um, so I'm hopeless with these kinds of center embedded constructions, and probably so are you. Yeah. Right. Let me get to the next chapter or the next topic where Ted shows how grammars prefer short dependencies. How do we know that? Yeah. So this is actually work that a former doctoral student of Ted's has been doing together with his group. And the basic idea is that we can look at what languages ordinarily do. Yeah? So sentences like Mary threw away the important documents that she brought home yesterday. And we can count sort of how many dependencies are there, how long are they on average, etc., etc., and you can get a number at the end. Yeah? And then you can compare that number to what happens when you just scramble the words in that sentence and check what kinds of outcome you have on the basis of that. Yeah? So here the words are in completely random order, so important documents happens to be back here, so that already is very long. Documents and the are also far apart, and so on and so forth. And what you see here is that lots of these dependencies are actually crossing, yeah, which, okay, if you scramble them randomly, they're going to do that. Yeah? But crucially, languages don't like crossed dependencies. Yeah? So they don't do that. And that actually was controlled for here. Yeah? So they wrote an algorithm that can scramble the words while avoiding crossed dependencies. So the version of the sentence that you see here is still randomized, scrambled, yeah, but in such a way that the arcs don't cross. Okay, so this, you might say, is an assessment that is more fair to, well, a comparison between what languages do and what they could theoretically do. Yeah. So obviously, the one with the random connections, there the dependency measure is off the charts. Yeah. But even here, when there are no crossing dependencies, it's much higher than what happens in the actual grammatical sentence. And you might say, all right, yeah, so you've done that for one sentence and it's a hand-picked one and it's only one language. Well, so here what was done actually in the research that Ted describes is that the researchers took corpus data, lots of sentences that were annotated in the dependency framework, and then all of those sentences were scrambled with crossing dependencies, without crossing dependencies, and then you can measure, well, how the ordinary grammar, the actual grammar, stacks up against the two scrambled variants. And here we have data from Ukrainian. On the x-axis we have the sentence length, so obviously the longer a sentence gets, the more dependencies there will be. And on the y-axis we have the dependency length, so generally it's going up and to the right. But the crucial thing that you see is that the black line, that's the actual corpus data. Yeah? So it goes up, but not as quickly, not as drastically as in the scrambled sentences. Yeah? So in the middle we have the scrambled sentence without crossing dependencies, and the dashed line, those are scrambled sentences with crossing dependencies allowed, and there you see even fairly short sentences, they go off the chart in terms of dependency length, and random stuff, well, leads to more complexity, more dependency. So essentially the conclusion is that languages optimize for simplicity to make the life of the speaker easier, but also to make the life of the hearer easier. So that is something that Ted talks about in the Friedman podcast. He says that he believes that the goals of the speaker and hearer are actually aligned with regard to this. Yeah. So sometimes the goals of the speaker and hearer are not aligned. I, as a speaker, want to get away with sloppy pronunciation to save effort on my part, and for the hearer that's difficult. Yeah. But creating sentences with simple dependencies, that is good for me because my brain has to do less work, and it's good for the hearer because also the hearer has to do less work in the end. Okay, so here I've shown you the graph for one language, Ukrainian, that the researchers worked on. Of course, they worked on a bunch of languages, like 53, and you see that the graph looks basically the same in all the languages. So we have the black line, the actual grammar, which is always, without fail, simpler than what we have in the scrambled sentences with or without crossed dependencies. Right. That's cool. I mean, yeah, it makes sense, but it's really nice to see these results like that. Let me move on to the next idea, language being independent from thought. Where does that come from? How is that argument made? Well, Gibson's position is that language is domain specific and not domain general. Yeah? So this really goes against usage-based approaches and the idea that language is really based on domain general sociocognitive processes like categorization, joint attention, metaphor, chunking, etc., etc. Yeah? And these are processes and skills that are at work also in non-linguistic stuff that we're doing cognitively. Yeah. So for a usage-based person, the prediction would be if we look at people's brains when they talk, we would probably expect to see all these areas being lit up, working in concert, and that's not what is observed, as we'll get to in a second. Yeah. Okay. That's the first position. The second is that syntax is autonomous. It's not related to meaning. And this, of course, goes against basic principles of construction grammar, where the idea is that, yeah, all syntax is meaningful. There are no meaningless syntactic patterns. Here, Ted just comes from the very opposite spectrum of syntactic thinking. And yeah, that makes it so interesting to read this book. If you're a construction grammarian or if you're inclined to agree with constructionist ideas, you read this book and every couple of pages I go, yes, absolutely. And then a couple of pages later, I go, no! So that's really, well, for me, I found that very stimulating. All right. And then the third point is against Sapir-Whorf, the structure of language and the lexicon does not affect the way we can think about the world. Okay, I'll get into each of these points in a bit more detail. But before I do, so here is a graph from the book. This is Ted's brain, where he was scanned doing language-related tasks, where you see that across different years, 2007, 2012, 2023. So what this graph represents is, so these areas are overrepresented in their activity when Ted does language-related tasks like reading words or processing sentences, things like that, engaging with language processing. So this tells us language processing is going on in these areas. And of course, there are lots of areas that are lit up, yeah. But the crucial point is that language is distinctive in some way. It's this happens when he processes language, and it doesn't happen when he does a math problem or when he has to figure out some kind of spatial reasoning puzzle or something else. Yeah. In the podcast, I found this interesting. In the podcast, he says that your language network in the brain is like your face. Over the years, it doesn't change much. Yeah, it changes a little bit. You get a couple of wrinkles, gray hair, but other than that, it stays recognizably the same. And well, it's fascinating. It's fascinating. Here's another graph that I wanted to show you. So these are the different kinds of tasks that Ted and other participants had been exposed to. And the bars, they show you how strong the activation is. Yeah, so this shows you the first two bars here. Yeah, auditory sentence comprehension and visual sentence comprehension. So listening and reading, they are like very, very active. And when there are other tasks, yeah, face perception, event semantics, numerical cognition, the language network just isn't that active. Yeah? So this is something, this is based on F. Fedorenko's work, and we have every reason to believe that, okay, this is something that we need to reckon with, and we can't really argue with the empirical detail. We have to come to an agreement what the interpretation of this really is or should be. Okay, just gonna leave this here. I wanted to show you Gibson's position on Sapir-Whorf, more specifically because here's something that I totally disagree with. Yeah. So Ted says, a working hypothesis for the ways in which languages may differ, based on their conceptual structure, is that such differences are at the structure of the lexicon. All of the meaning differences between languages are in the words, not the syntax. No, I disagree, totally. Yeah. So there are so many meaning differences in the grammars of languages, and to me, that's where the important stuff happens. Yeah. So words you can make up and translate, and it's really not that big of a deal. But the way that grammar makes you see the world and reason about the world and organize your thoughts, that is just, well, I disagree, yeah? And it's not just me. So I just wanted to point out work by Panos Athanasopoulos, who has studied Whorfian effects in grammatical aspect, in motion events, in grammatical gender, in tense, in numbers, so singular, plural, versus languages that don't have this kind of distinction. And so Gibson cites his work, but only with regard to color perception, which arguably you could say, okay, that's lexical, that's not really grammatical. But there's this huge chunk of his work that just doesn't appear. And I wonder if Ted doesn't know it or doesn't consider it important enough to be mentioned there. I don't know. It's just that, yeah, I found this a little strange. Okay, I'm already coming to an end. So I think you can sense that I was really stimulated by this book. I think you should go and read it. I think it's excellent. And I would love to sit down and talk to Ted about this in more detail. If you would like to know more about the book, here's the YouTube Lex Friedman podcast that I talked about. So if you have 2 hours and 50 minutes to spend sometime, I listened actually to the entire thing. So I was doing other stuff at the same time, like cooking, and you can listen to this while you're working out or cleaning your room or I don't know what. It's really great. So Ted explains really complicated concepts like Chomsky movement and center embedding, like on the fly, to Lex Friedman, who's not a linguist, and it's amazing how he does that. Yeah. So I'm in admiration, and go download the book, read it. Let me know if your opinion is different or if you have other points that you observe. And that's it for this video. Thanks for watching and see you soon.